Okay, let's unpack this. You know how sometimes to really uh, get to grips with something complex, you have to step back. Look at it not just in isolation, but like as part of a bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like studying a tree. You see the bark, the leaves, sure. But to really understand it, you kind of need to know about the soil it's in, the climate, the whole ecosystem around it.
That's a great analogy.
And political science, well, it often seems focused on the formal stuff, right? Governments, laws,
Yeah.
elections, the power structures. But is that really the whole story? Is it just the tree or is it the forest?
Well, that perception that political science is just this self-contained thing, it's understandable. Its core is often the state and formal processes. But the source material we're diving into today, An Introduction to Political Theory by O.P. Gaba, it makes this really strong case that, well, to truly grasp politics, you absolutely have to look beyond those boundaries. You need to see the forest.
And that's exactly what we're trying to do in this deep dive, isn't it? We're using Goba's text as our guide, our map, to explore what he calls the interdisciplinary approach in political science.
Right.
Basically, the idea that politics isn't just happening in some kind of vacuum. It's like deeply woven into everything else in society.
Precisely. And our goal here is to unpack the main ideas from the text. We need to define what this interdisciplinary approach actually means, dig into why Gaba argues it became not just useful, but, well, essential.
Necessary, even.
Necessary, exactly. And look at the specific ways it draws on other fields, history, economics, sociology, psychology, even philosophy comes into it. By pulling out the key nuggets here, the aim is that you, the listener, can get a really clear handle on why this broader view is seen as so vital for modern political analysis.
Absolutely. Let's cut through the jargon and get to the heart of it. So first things first. Before interdisciplinary, what exactly is a discipline in this context? What does Gaba say?
Okay, so the text lays it out pretty clearly. A discipline is basically a branch of learning, a distinct field of study. It's got its own methods, its own theories, its own focus.
Like physics or history or
Yeah,
political science itself?
exactly. History, economics, physics, those are all disciplines, separate boxes of knowledge, as you put it earlier.
Got it.
And then the source groups some of these together as social sciences. These are the fields specifically focused on studying human society, how people behave in society, the relationships they form.
So political science, economics, sociology.
Right. Social psychology, cultural anthropology, too. The text lists those as key examples. They're all looking systematically at different aspects of how humans live together.
Okay, different angles on the same human social world. And the source mentions some fields kind of bridge the gap, right, between social and physical sciences.
Yeah, it acknowledges that complexity. Like you could think about human geography versus physical geography or parts of anthropology. But for this discussion, the focus stays mainly on the social side.
Okay, clear. So with discipline and social science defined, what is the interdisciplinary approach? How does Galba define that core concept?
Right. This is the key. The source defines it as relying on more than one discipline when you're studying something. Or, put another way, it's the tendency for one field to draw upon or even contribute to multiple other fields.
So breaking down the walls between those boxes of knowledge.
Exactly. You're not just sticking to your own toolkit inside your own box. You're
Mhm.
reaching over, grabbing tools, insights, data from other boxes to understand what's going on in yours.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And the source says this works particularly well for the social sciences.
Yes, that's a crucial point it makes. It's not just a generally good idea, it's especially suited, maybe even fundamental, for the social sciences.
Why? What makes the social sciences so ripe for this kind of borrowing and sharing?
Well, think about it. Unlike, say, astronomy and marine biology, which study very different things, the social sciences, they're often dealing with common problems. Or they're looking at different facets of the same basic reality. Humans living together.
Ah, right. Human behavior, social structures, power.
Mm.
These things don't just neatly fit into one box called sociology or politics.
Exactly. They pop up everywhere. How people interact, cultural norms, economic pressures, political decisions, they're all intertwined. So the disciplines studying them are bound to overlap.
So it's like everyone's describing the same elephant just from different angles. The interdisciplinary approach is getting them all to, well, talk to each other to describe the whole thing.
That's a really good way to think about it. You get a more complete, a more holistic picture. And the main benefit the source highlights is exactly that, a broader perspective.
Right.
Integrating insights from different fields leads to a more thorough, more nuanced, and ultimately a more fruitful understanding. It helps you avoid having those disciplinary blinkers on.
So if you're trying to understand, say, political polarization today,
Yeah.
you wouldn't just look at voting data or political rhetoric in isolation.
No, you couldn't get the full picture that way.
You'd need to bring in the economic anxieties maybe fueling it, the sociological shifts in communities, maybe the psychological reasons certain messages land so strongly, even historical parallels.
Absolutely. You bring all those lenses, economic, sociological, psychological, historical, to bear on the political question. And the source specifically says that studying politics as a social process gives loads of scope for this approach.
Politics as a social process. What does that mean practically for being interdisciplinary, according to Galba?
Okay, the source breaks it down into like three main things. First, it means actively using the findings, the theories, the models that have been developed in other social sciences to help understand political stuff.
So importing existing knowledge from field B to shed light on field A, which is politics.
Exactly. Second, it involves a kind of mutual checking or verification. You can take theories or findings from political science and see if they hold up when you look at data or theories from other social sciences.
Like, does my theory about voting behavior match what sociologists know about group identity? That sort of thing.
Precisely. You're cross-referencing, strengthening your claims. And third, it's about developing such a broad, integrated view within political science that its insights actually contribute back to the other fields.
So it's not just borrowing, it's potentially giving back too. Political science can offer insights useful for sociologists or economists.
That's the potential the source points to. It could become a hub, generating knowledge valuable across disciplines. But, and this is really crucial, Galba stresses this isn't just about randomly throwing bits of other fields into your political analysis.
Right, you can't just name drop Freud or mention supply and demand without a reason.
Exactly. It has to be purposeful. It has to be well conceived. Any reference to economics, sociology, psychology, whatever, it must be done with the specific aim of understanding political problems. You're using those other disciplines as tools for political analysis, not studying, say, economic theory for its own sake within your political science work.
The political question always has to be the driver. The other fields are in service of that goal. Can you give an example of that, like purposeful application?
Sure. The source uses the example of studying something like labor management relations or maybe the psychology of how crowds behave. A political scientist might study these, but their focus has to be squarely on the impact these things have on politics.
So how do strikes affect elections? Or how does crowd behavior influence political movements?
Exactly. The goal remains understanding the political consequences or connections, not just understanding industrial relations or crowd psychology in general.
Okay, that distinction is key. Integrated, yes, but the political focus remains primary. So this sounds quite deliberate, quite modern. Was politics always analyzed this way, consciously pulling from other fields?
Well, the source calls it a recent trend, especially in its systematic form. But it does say you can find, let's call them rudimentary forms, or maybe an implicit understanding of these connections way back in traditional political thought.
Rudimentary. Like how far back are we talking? Ancient Greece.
Precisely. Think about the big names. The source mentions Plato. When he was designing his ideal state, he was clearly linking the structure of the family and the type of education people received to the character and effectiveness of the rulers.
So he saw that social stuff, family, education, shaped the political leadership.
Yeah, implicitly linking social structures to political outcomes. Aristotle is another example the text gives. He systematically looked at how the distribution of wealth and social status in a community related to the kind of political regime it had, oligarchy, democracy, whatever. He sought a direct link between socioeconomic factors and the type of government.
Wow. So even thousands of years ago, they saw these connections, wealth, status, shaping politics.
They definitely did. But the source adds a caveat. It notes these earlier studies, while they often lacked deeper analysis of the forces shaping the course of events. They saw the connections, perhaps, but maybe didn't systematically unpack the how and why with the kind of rigor later approaches aim for.
Okay, so they spotted the links, but didn't maybe have the tools or the focus to dissect the mechanisms in a really systematic way. When does it start getting more systematic then?
The source points to the mid-19th century, and it highlights Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as possibly the first to develop a truly systematic, interdisciplinary approach, especially within the social sciences.
Marx and Engels, big figures, obviously straddling economics, history, philosophy, politics.
Exactly. And their whole project, as Gaba describes it, was essentially about locating the root causes of political behavior, legal systems, culture, ideology, all of it, in the underlying socioeconomic factors.
The base and superstructure idea.
Right. Systematically tracing things back to the level of technology, the mode of production, how things are made and owned, and the resulting class structure. It was a comprehensive theory deliberately using economic and sociological analysis to explain political phenomena.
A massive, systematic, interdisciplinary framework.
That's the argument the source makes. And interestingly, it also notes that even modern liberal political scientists, who obviously disagree fundamentally with Marxian conclusions, also broadly accept that you have to understand various social factors to really understand the political process.
So the basic idea that politics is embedded in society is pretty widely shared now
Yeah.
across different schools of thought.
Yes, the source suggests that underlying recognition is there, even if the specific factors they focus on or how they interpret them are very different. Like, a Marxist and a pluralist will point to different social forces, but both agree you have to look beyond just formal politics.
Okay, so we've got a definition, traced its roots, seen its systematic start. Now let's really dig into the why. According to the source, why did this approach become not just useful, but imperative? What changed in political science?
A major driver, according to the source, was the shift towards seeing the political system as an open system, or, more broadly, a system of interactions.
An open system. What does that mean for politics? Is it like not closed off?
Exactly. Think about it. Traditionally, maybe the focus was just on the internal gears of government, how parliament works, what the courts do. The open system view, which came from systems analysis and social science, sees the political system as constantly interacting with its environment, which is the broader social system.
Okay.
It takes in inputs from that environment, things like demands from citizens, support for policies, information, pressure groups.
Right, people wanting things from the government or protesting.
Exactly. The system processes these inputs and then produces outputs, laws, decisions, policies. And these outputs then go back out into the social environment and often create feedback, which then generates new inputs. It's a cycle.
Like a demand for better roads,
Yeah.
input, the government builds roads, output, people are happier or maybe complain about taxes, feedback leading to new demands, new input.
That's a perfect, simple example. It's this continuous loop. And the huge implication, the source argues, is that if you want to understand any part of that loop, where the demands come from, how the system reacts, what the policies actually do to society, you just cannot stay inside the political box.
You have to look outside.
You must. You have to look at the social processes that generate those inputs, feel the effects of the outputs, and create the feedback. You can't understand the system without understanding the environment it lives in.
Because those inputs aren't just political. They come from people's economic lives, their social groups, their cultural values, all that stuff outside formal politics.
Precisely. The very idea of an open system embedded in society makes looking at other social sciences a logical necessity.
Okay, the open system idea is a big one. What else made interdisciplinarity imperative?
The source links it very strongly to the rise of an empirical orientation in political science, a major shift.
Empirical, meaning based on evidence, observation, facts, like science.
Exactly that. The source contrasts this sharply with the traditional approach, which was often deeply tied to philosophy. That older tradition was frequently normative, focused on what ought to be. Designing the ideal state, figuring out the principles of perfect justice in the abstract. Plato's Republic is the classic example.
Thinking about the best possible politics, not necessarily the politics we actually have.
Right. The empirical approach, however, focuses on what is. It relies on factual information, observation, direct experience. Its goal is to describe and explain the political world as it actually functions, warts and all.
So studying how Congress really makes laws, not just how the Constitution says it should.
Precisely. Now, the source points out that other social sciences, anthropology, sociology, economics, psychology, they generally embrace this empirical approach earlier than political science, mostly around the end of the 19th century. That's partly why they spun off from philosophy as distinct fields.
They started collecting data, doing surveys, observing behavior earlier.
Generally, yes. Political science, the source says, was a relatively late starter in making this empirical turn. And here's the crucial link. When political science did start moving towards empiricism, wanting to study the real world of politics, it quickly realized it needed help.
Help from those other fields that were already doing empirical work.
Exactly. To study actual political behavior, to collect data on how institutions really work, to test hypotheses about cause and effect. Political science was naturally drawn to the methods, data, and theories already developed in sociology, psychology, economics. Those fields had a head start on empirically studying human behavior and social structures.
So the desire to be more scientific, to base study on facts, pushed political science towards borrowing from fields that had already gone down that road.
That's a key argument in the source. And this empirical drive led directly to two other big shifts that also cemented the need for interdisciplinarity, a focus on political behavior and the use of systems analysis.
We touched on systems analysis with the open system. Tell me more about the shift to political behavior.
Okay, so traditionally, the focus was often on the institutions, the presidency, parliament, the courts. The political behavior shift changed the main object of study. Instead of just describing the structure of parliament, the focus moved to understanding the actions and interactions of the people involved in politics.
Like, why do people vote the way they do? How do lobbyists actually influence politicians? What makes people join a political party?
Exactly. It's about the dynamic actions of individuals and groups. Voters, legislators, bureaucrats, activists, elites. And this is where the need for other disciplines becomes really obvious. The source quotes Heinz Eulau, a big name in this area. He said basically that since political behavior is just one part of a person's total social behavior, you have to be interdisciplinary. You can't ignore the wider social, cultural, and personal factors that shape how someone acts politically.
That makes total sense. You can't just cut out the political slice of a person and ignore everything else about them, their job, their family, their beliefs, their personality.
Right. A person doesn't suddenly become a purely political being when they walk into a polling booth. Their political actions are shaped by their whole life experience. So you naturally need insights from sociology, psychology, anthropology to understand that behavior.
And how did systems analysis, beyond the open system idea, reinforce this?
Well, using systems analysis, particularly as developed by people like David Easton, really hammers home this idea of the political system as a subsystem within the bigger social system. It stresses that government bodies don't just make decisions in isolation, they're responding to demands from society, and their decisions have consequences for society.
So again, it forces you to look at the connections. To understand the political system's inputs and outputs, you need to understand the social context it's embedded in.
Correct. This framework makes understanding the economic conditions, the cultural values, the psychological makeup of the population, the sociological structures, it makes all that essential to fully grasp the political process. So these shifts together, the open system view, the empirical turn, focusing on behavior using systems analysis, they all pointed in the same direction, making interdisciplinarity, as the source puts it, imperative.
Okay, the why is really clear now. It's about dealing with the sheer complexity of politics as part of society. So let's get practical. How does political science actually use these other fields? The source mentions data, theories, models. Let's start with data.
Right. So the basic idea is that society as a whole, right, with all these interconnected parts, economic, social, cultural, political. Political science focuses on the political part, but it knows that part is shaped by all the others. So it needs data about those other parts.
What kind of data are we talking about? Give us some specific examples from the source.
Okay, the source lists quite a few. Things like the rate of economic growth, how national income is spread out, who owns the wealth, education levels, literacy rates, dominant religious or cultural beliefs, family structures, what kinds of jobs people do, the balance between city and country populations.
Wow, that's a really wide range. How would a political scientist actually use data on, say, literacy rates or income inequality?
Well, the source gives an example. Imagine you're trying to figure out if democracy is likely to survive and work well in a particular country. You can't just look at their constitution. You need to know about the underlying society.
Right.
Really high inequality or very low literacy or maybe deep ethnic divisions, those things might make stable democracy much harder. So political scientists need data on those factors, which often comes from economists, sociologists, demographers.
Ah, so the data helps paint a picture of the social ground the political system is built on or the challenges it faces.
Exactly. And the source connects this to specific research areas in political science. Like if you're studying political socialization, how people learn their political beliefs, you need data on attitude formation, which comes from psychology and sociology. If you're studying political development, how countries change politically over time, you often need data from sociology on social change and from economics on growth.
And political communication.
Draws heavily on social psychology, yeah, how messages spread, how people are persuaded. It's like building a complex model. You need bits of data from all over the place to make it work.
It seems obvious when you put it like that.
It does. And the source quotes Seymour Martin Lipset, a very influential figure, to drive this home. Lipset said, look, if you're studying political development, you have to look at things like social mobilization, how people move into modern society, which is a sociological concept. Becoming a citizen involves changes in values, and personality, that's psychology. Politics works differently in societies with caste systems versus those without, that's sociology and anthropology. Kinship ties matter. Class and status affect whether people accept the rule of law. All these examples show you need sociological and psychological data and ideas to understand basic political processes.
That Lipset example really nails it. You can't understand democracy taking root without understanding the social and psychological shifts happening alongside it.
Absolutely. Now, beyond just the raw data, the interdisciplinary approach also means using theories and models from other fields.
So not just borrowing facts, but borrowing ways of thinking, frameworks for understanding.
Exactly. Borrowing analytical tools and explanatory structures. The source gives some really key examples. Think about elite theory.
Right, the idea that a small group always holds power.
Yeah. That idea was really systematically developed first by sociologists Pareto, Mosca, Michels. They argued that even in democracies, power inevitably concentrates in a small, organized elite.
And political science took that idea and ran with it.
Pretty much. It was adopted to analyze political parties, bureaucracies, interest groups, offering a, shall we say, more critical or realistic view of how democratic power actually works compared to the ideal.
So a sociological theory became a major lens for political analysis. What else?
Well, we mentioned the Marxian base and superstructure model earlier. Rooted in economics and historical analysis, it claims the economic system shapes everything else: politics, law, culture. This framework was adopted as a powerful tool within political science for analyzing the deep connections between economic structures and political power.
Seeing politics is fundamentally driven by economics.
Right. And even some really fundamental concepts in modern political science have borrowed origins. David Easton's whole idea of the political system, which is central to a lot of analysis, that concept was directly derived from the sociological concept of the social system.
Wow, so the very way political scientists often frame their subject came from sociology.
Correct. Or think about the structural functional approach. This way of analyzing how different parts of a system contribute to keeping the whole thing going. It actually started in cultural anthropology, with people like Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown studying tribal societies.
Okay.
Then it was picked up by sociologists like Talcott Parsons, and then it was introduced into political science by scholars like Gabriel Ullman and Bingham Powell, especially for comparing political systems and studying development.
So that idea journeyed from anthropology to sociology to political science.
It shows how ideas can cross these disciplinary boundaries. The source also mentions Harold Laswell's problem-solving approach in political analysis, linking it to psychology focusing on psychological motives and how societies address problems. Even the way we sometimes analyze politics as bargaining, like negotiating deals, that borrows from economic theories of market competition.
Using economic models of how firms compete to understand how political actors negotiate.
Exactly. The source mentions thinkers like Schumpeter and Anthony Downs, who applied economic models, politicians as entrepreneurs, voters as consumers in a marketplace, to analyze democratic politics. That's a very clear borrowing of an economic model to understand political competition.
These examples really show how deeply political science has woven in ideas, not just data, from elsewhere. It's borrowed core ways of thinking about systems, power, motivation, competition. Okay, let's get even more specific. The source talks about individual disciplines. Let's start with history. How does history help?
Okay, history. The source points to two main ways it's useful. First, the obvious one. History is just this huge repository of data, of evidence, past events, trends, developments. They provide the raw material we need to understand current politics, to compare different political systems or eras, and crucially, to test our theories.
So if I have a theory about why revolutions happen, I look at the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, etc., the historical data to see if my theory fits.
Exactly. History provides the case studies. The second way is when history offers more than just facts, when it suggests cause and effect patterns or even broad laws of historical development. The source mentions Marx's theory of history again here as an example of history providing a framework for understanding the direction of change, driven by economic forces. If you accept such a historical theory, it gives you a lens to analyze politics.
So seeing patterns in the past helps us understand the forces at play now.
Right. Now, the source brings up those classic quotes like, history without political science has no fruit. Political science without history has no root.
Yeah. And Freeman's history is past politics, politics is present history, really ties them together.
It does, and it shows this link has long been recognized. But the source argues those views are a bit of an oversimplification now. Political science has its own identity. But it still uses historical material constantly, just more selectively, more purposefully. You simply can't understand, say, the Indian political system today or current international conflicts without knowing the history behind them.
History provides the essential backstory, the context.
Absolutely. And there's been a kind of simultaneous change of outlook in both fields that strengthens the connection now. Political science, as we said, got more interested in socioeconomic factors, and modern historians also realized they need to look beyond just kings and battles to understand the socioeconomic forces shaping history, the role of ordinary people.
Ah, so both fields broaden their focus to include society and economy more.
Yes. And the shared focus reinforces their mutual relevance. The source really stresses that political science theories, if they want to be robust, need to be substantiated and verified by historical data. Theories based just on abstract thought or limited observation, they lack scientific precision and thus crumble. History is the testing ground.
History gives political science its empirical backbone, in a way. Okay, what about economics?
Economics. Its core business is human behavior around producing, distributing, exchanging stuff, how we make decisions about scarce resources, money, labor, goods.
The nuts and bolts of wealth and resources.
Pretty much. But the source immediately flags a key point. These purely economic decisions, they're greatly affected by non-economic factors. Culture shapes what we buy, psychology affects how we invest, politics impacts trade, social status influences job opportunities.
So even economic behavior isn't purely economic. It's tangled up with everything else.
Exactly, which shows the inherent overlap. And historically, the source notes, economics actually started as political economy back in the 18th century. It was about managing the state's finances, the nation's wealth. It only tried to become a separate, pure science later, focusing just on markets and prices, especially with laissez-faire ideas.
So they started together, drifted apart.
Yeah.
Then what? Did they come back together?
Well, the source argues that the results of unchecked laissez-faire economics, huge inequalities, exploitations, social unrest, basically forced a reunion. It showed that economics can't just ignore the social and political consequences. It needs regulation, public control. That brought politics right back into the picture.
Politics had to step in to deal with the economic fallout.
Precisely. And think about modern politics. So much of it is about conflicts between groups over economic issues, right? Wages, taxes, trade, welfare. These are economic demands fought out politically.
And any political system's survival depends on managing these economic conflicts.
Absolutely. The source says no system lasts if it can't cope with these demands. Find some balance. Political decisions on budgets, trade deals, inflation, they're meaningless, devoid of essence, without getting the economics right.
And with the modern welfare state, governments are directly involved in the economy anyway.
Exactly. Providing jobs, healthcare, pensions, tackling poverty in developing nations. Politics cannot deliver the goods, the source says, can't provide stability or improve lives without effectively grappling with economics. It even brings up the Marxian view again, that politics is ultimately shaped by economic forces.
So for a political scientist, knowing economics isn't just handy, it's essential. And this brings us back to political economy.
Yes. Modern political economy, the source explains, deals with the political side of economic policymaking. It asks not just, is this policy efficient, but also, is it politically possible? Is it fair? Who wins, who loses? It uses shared concepts like costs, utility, allocation, and it looks at how economic factors shape politics, like how recessions affect elections and how political choices shape the economy, like how regulations affect businesses.
And using things like rational choice theory, assuming people act economically in politics, that fits here too.
Perfect example. Borrowing economic models to explain political behavior is a big part of modern political economy. The source also mentions the Marxist version, focusing on how the whole mode of production shapes society and politics. So yeah, economics provides crucial data, explains key conflicts, and offers powerful analytical tools.
All right, let's move to sociology, the study of society itself. How does that feed into politics?
Sociology looks broadly at how people behave in groups, how we form societies, build institutions, interact. It covers, as the source says, almost every aspect of human behavior in a social context.
The science of us living together.
Basically, yes. And interestingly, the source notes that the founding figures of sociology, people like Max Weber, Michaels, Pareto, Durkheim, they were deeply interested in politics from the start. They couldn't really study social structures without looking at political institutions, power, how political attitudes are formed.
So sociology was looking at political questions right from its birth certificate.
Pretty much. And it influenced political science, too. The source mentions Arthur Bentley, trained as a sociologist, became huge in political science, arguing politics as group struggle. And Franklin Giddings, another sociologist, pushed for early empirical studies of voting back in the 1920s.
So sociologists helped nudge political science towards studying real behavior in groups. And this cross-fertilization led to
Political sociology. The source defines this as the field applying sociological concepts and methods directly to politics. Political sociologists explain political behavior using social factors, and they apply sociological analyses like Weber on bureaucracy or McCall's on elites to political parties, unions, government agencies, you name it.
using sociological understanding of organizations to analyze political ones.
Exactly, and it's vital for policy, too. Politics involves making decisions for the public. To make good decisions, ones that work, you have to understand social motivations, values, potential reactions.
You can't just impose a policy from on high without knowing how society might respond.
Precisely. You need to understand people's attitudes, habits, beliefs, even prejudices to figure out if a policy will be accepted or if it will work. That's sociology and social psychology territory. Since modern politics goes way beyond just formal rules, needing to understand the social context, sociology becomes essential.
And political sociology is where this all comes together.
Yes, it's described as a thriving field built by contributions from both sides. The source lists core topics: political socialization, how we become political, political culture, shared beliefs, political participation, who gets involved and why, the social basis of politics, class, religion, ethnicity effects, ideology, social divisions versus consensus, power, authority, legitimacy, leadership styles, all viewed through a sociological lens.
That list really drives home how intertwined social life and political life are. Okay, next up, psychology.
Psychology focuses on the individual motivations, behavior, why people differ, how much comes from internal makeup versus social situations.
Understanding the individual mind and actions.
Right. And particularly relevant is social psychology, which grew out of psychology's interest in how being in groups affects individuals.
Which seems immediately applicable to politics, people acting in parties, crowds, nations.
Extremely relevant. As psychologists studied attitude formation, they naturally started looking at political attitudes and values. The source highlights a key historical moment: the rise of fascism and totalitarianism in the 30s and 40s. That sparked huge interest in things like the authoritarian personality, using psychological theories to understand why people were drawn to extremist politics.
Using psychology to explain political extremism. A direct link.
Yes. And people like Harold Lasswell applied similar psychological perspectives to study motivations in politics more broadly. Beyond extremism, think about core political processes: how public opinion forms and changes, why some leaders have charisma, the impact of propaganda, how mass media shapes our political views and culture.
All things where understanding human psychology seems crucial. How people are persuaded, how they connect with leaders.
Exactly. Social psychology is particularly helpful here, the source says. And this interface created political psychology, seen as a branch of social psychology focused on these political questions.
So psychology, social psychology, political psychology, applying insights about the individual mind in social context directly to the political world.
That sums it up well. It helps us understand the inner workings, the motivations, perceptions, interactions of political actors at all levels.
Finally, philosophy. This feels like coming full circle back to the roots. How does philosophy connect to modern empirical political science?
Well, as we said, traditional politics was philosophy. Philosophy tackles the biggest questions: reality, knowledge, truth, values, morality, purpose. It uses empirical data, sure, but its main job is often clarifying concepts beyond what pure observation can tell us. It probes the substantive nature of things: reality, humanity, society, politics.
the why and what does it mean questions.
Right.
And when it focuses on politics, that's political philosophy.
Right. And political philosophy, the source says, deals with the moral and substantive side of politics. It asks questions science can't answer alone. What's the good life? What's justice? Why should we obey the state? Are certain institutions or policies morally right or wrong?
So political science might tell us how a policy affects different groups,
Yeah.
but political philosophy asks if that policy is fair or just.
Exactly. It uses logic, conceptual analysis, historical context to figure out what ought to be the ideals, the principles for political life. It overlaps a lot with moral philosophy and normative political theory.
And the source distinguishes philosophy and science clearly here.
It does. Science relies only on empirical evidence, sense experience. It's descriptive. What is? Philosophy uses empirical evidence, but also goes beyond it with reason and speculation transcendental. It's critical, evaluative, prescriptive, what ought to be.
Different tools, different goals. Describe reality versus judge reality and propose ideals.
Right. But then crucially, the source adds, science itself is a product of philosophy. Science emerged from philosophical inquiry into knowledge and reality. It mentions compite, tracing science to positive philosophy. So philosophy is the parent, in a way.
Philosophy provided the foundations for scientific thinking itself.
That's the view presented. Now, the rise of scientific method, especially behavioralism in political science around the 50s and 60s, led to a real push to separate political science, empirical, from political philosophy, normative. But the source points out that since the early 70s and the post-behavioral era, there's been a major revival of interest in political philosophy.
That's when big questions about justice, rights, liberty came roaring back, like with Rawls.
Exactly. The source argues that while empirical science is great for finding facts and effective tools to achieve policy goals, the goals themselves, what society should be aiming for, are largely decided with the help of political philosophy.
So science tells us how to build the bridge efficiently, but philosophy helps us debate if we should build it, where, and why, based on values like fairness or community need.
That's a perfect way to put it. Empirical political science can analyze different voting systems, but political philosophy helps us argue which system is more just or better serves values like equality or representation. Philosophy clarifies concepts, defines goals, and provides the moral compass for evaluating political life.
Okay, wow. We've covered the what, why, and how of the interdisciplinary approach and drilled down into specific contributions from history, economics, sociology, psychology, and philosophy. Bringing it all together, what's the final takeaway from Galba on this integrated view?
Well, the source circles back to say this systematic interdisciplinary approach is definitely modern. It's different from, say, Aristotle's time when politics was the master science, but didn't really separate the empirical is from the normative ought in the way we do now.
And it arose as these different social sciences became distinct fields themselves.
Exactly. In Aristotle's day, it was all just philosophy. Then, around the 19th century, different aspects of social life started being studied empirically, on their own terms. Psychology, sociology, economics, and eventually political science emerged as separate scientific disciplines.
So first they specialized and separated, and then the interdisciplinary approach emerged to consciously reconnect their findings.
Precisely. The point isn't to dissolve the disciplines back into one big blob. The interdisciplinary approach insists that our understanding in any one area should be informed by and checked against the findings from all the other relevant social sciences.
It's about synthesis, bringing the specialized knowledge back together.
Yes. And it's a two-way street. Political science uses insights from others, and it should generate insights for others, enriching everyone's understanding.
And the ultimate goal.
To get beyond partial views. The source argues that relying only on one lens, just historical, just economic, just sociological, gives you an incomplete, partial picture. The interdisciplinary approach tries to overcome this shortcoming by relying on all other relevant disciplines, evolving an integrated view. It's about seeing the whole complex reality of politics as part of the wider human social world.
So the big message from this deep dive really is that to truly understand politics, real world, messy politics, you absolutely have to look beyond just the political institutions. You need history, economics, sociology, psychology, philosophy. You need to see how they all weave together to shape political life and how politics shapes them back. It's about that open system constantly interacting.
Exactly. No single discipline has all the answers. The richest understanding often comes from bridging the gaps.
Which makes studying politics endlessly fascinating and maybe a bit daunting too.
It definitely demands curiosity and a willingness to connect different kinds of knowledge.
So here's something for you, our listeners, to maybe chew on based on this whole open system idea.
Hmm.
If our political life really is so deeply tied into everything else, the economy, culture, society, our own psychology, our history, then what aspects of your own social environment, the world right around you, do you think are most powerfully shaping the political inputs and outputs you see today? And flipping that, how are today's political decisions filtering down and reshaping the economic, social, or cultural life of your community? Thinking about those connections, maybe using some of these different disciplinary lenses we've talked about, might offer some really interesting perspectives on the forces shaping our world right now.
It's a powerful way to look at current events for sure.
Indeed it is.